Sabrina thinks it might be a cold and looks for medicine for him in a drawer, but the protagonist calls for her, saying it's not just a cold, the guy is dying. His words alarm her, but she tries to be positive, saying he has gone through many hardships since the beginning of the storm. It's a shame that an employee like him isn't recognized. If they were in the company, she would nominate him as the best employee of the quarter, and he thanks, almost powerless, his lovely boss and wife. Sabrina says she hasn't accepted marrying him yet, and hands him a glass of water to take the medicine. Howard is so bad that he can hardly hold the glass. Before Sabrina could help, the glass falls to the floor and breaks. Howard passed out again, and upon opening his eyes, he finds Sabrina lying on top of him. She pulls his sheet and asks him to get up, trying to cheer him up, saying she knows he's pretending to be sick just to please her, but this time she won't punish him for it. The protagonist feels terrible and asks her to get up because he wants to talk. Sabrina gets annoyed and asks if he isn't man enough, but actually, she's just sad and doesn't want to admit that he's on his last legs. He tells her that the gas will last for 3 months, and after that, she should head north. He also mentions there are seeds in the warehouse, and for her to learn how to operate the generator with the manual will be easy. He advises her to practice target shooting and to get a cold-proof house. Day 180 arrives, and Howard is still alive. He's looking at the city with Sabrina. Sabrina mentions that it has stopped snowing and the temperature is rising. Once the snow melts, she'll head north to try to find more survivors. Howard asks her if she really loved him. She looks at him deeply and says no. The protagonist thinks, thankfully, he has no worries then. Sabrina continues, saying he's conceited. Why would she love him? She says he has no qualities, never says anything to cheer her up, always does everything on his own, and never asks for her help. She concludes by calling him an idiot, but from the images, we know she really loved him. Now we see the protagonist lying on the ground with AI-63 near him. She congratulates him for completing the survival challenge, but he looks dazed and says he doesn't remember much. The woman explains that it's normal. The system makes you not remember anything precisely to avoid confusing what's real and what's a dream, and gradually, in a month, he'll remember everything. But he remembers leaving Sabrina in that world and asks what will happen to her there if the dream world will continue to exist. The woman says it was just a game and it's over now, and he shouldn't dwell on it because it was just a dream and he has a real life to live. He becomes pensive, and since he doesn't remember much, he doesn't have much to say. AI-63 then says it's time to calculate the scores, and a screen with information appears. He got a B and earned 50 credits, which she finds reasonable considering the amount of foolishness he displayed. She explains that if he had let the person in the game with him die, he would have gotten a D, and if he had managed to get abundant food, shelter, built a transmission network to find other survivors, and even tamed animals, he could have gotten an S. He tells her he's just a normal human, but for her, it doesn't matter because this was a level 0 challenge for new players and the final version arrives in a month. She shows him the next challenge called Frankenstein's Invasion and says these games are to enhance human life. He's not sure if he'll play again because from what he remembers, it was terrible and exhausting. But AI-63 says it also had its joys and shows him images of him sleeping with Sabrina. He's shocked seeing the images and says she shouldn't have seen that, but she's a robot so she has no emotions. He asks if Sabrina has these memories, but the robot says it's impossible. He asks how to leave this place, and she explains he just needs to rub his left eye to activate the menu. Before leaving, she says he has a reward, and he asks to deliver it to his workplace, but a dark mist envelopes him, and the robot tells him not to panic because the system is deciding the right reward for him. But he is panicking and afraid when 2 eyes appear behind him, and it's actually a giant wolf, and he remembers fighting wolves. When the wolf prepares to attack him, a giant appears and comes running, throwing a spear from a great distance and hitting the wolf, which falls dead in front of the protagonist. And it seems all this was to illustrate the skill that the protagonist gained, precise throwing. While Howard was still processing everything that happened, suddenly he wakes up to the sound of his alarm clock ringing. He gets up and wonders why he was thrown out of the game since he didn't press the exit button. He touches his eye and nothing happens. The system doesn't respond anymore, and Howard can't tell if he's in a game or in real life. Inside the game, We see AI-63 asking why Howard was forced to exit, and the system responds, "Alert, system failures. Memory control function has been deactivated." The woman asks to trace the error code, and the system shows an image from the past when Sabrina was in the game and had that dream. AI-63 says this is not possible. How could there be a dream within another dream? And asks the system to find a way to fix the flaw. No correction could be found in the database. She becomes disheartened, knowing she'll have to fix the code alone. We see Sabrina in real life. She wakes up with tears in her eyes and has two nurses with her. They ask what happened to Sabrina, and she says she had a dream but can't remember, and asks why the two are in her room. They look at each other and say that in the early hours Sabrina was sleepwalking, took a knife from the kitchen murmuring something, and then Sabrina remembers Howard. It seems something happened with the system, and Sabrina now knows everything. The two nurses suggest Sabrina take a few days off, but she's very shaken, saying it wasn't a dream. In the middle of the city, where traffic and people are everywhere, Howard is disoriented. After spending 6 months in the dream world, he is now bumping into people because he's not used to seeing so many. He passes by a food cart, and the cook asks if he wants his usual, also mentioning a lovely girl and if he wants to be introduced, but he is startled when he sees Howard with his hand in the fire, thinking the dream was so real that even now he still feels the cold. The cook insists on talking about the girl, but Howard says he has a girlfriend now. He arrives at the building where he works and checks his phone to see the time, but fortunately he's not late. A hand touches his shoulder, and when he turns, he sees his friend Donald and excitedly says how long it's been since they've seen each other. But Donald, the mannequin, Donald, his friend, says they had dinner together last night. The protagonist apologizes, thinking it's been 6 months for him. Donald tells him to keep an eye out because they're trying to create a marketing department, and that will make them useless in the company. But the protagonist says he doesn't care. He's going to quit himself because the world is wonderful and he has many choices. His friend is amazed at how he changed from one day to the next. At his desk, Howard doesn't know what to do, so he picks up a contact book to start doing something useful. He tears a piece of the paper he was writing on and throws it into the trash. But something strange catches his attention, a different sensation. So he tears another sheet and tries to throw it again into a farther trash basket. He carefully aims and throws, hitting it, and mentions how throwing feels so easy. Then he remembers AI-63 talking about his reward, and how is this possible? He, like me, thought this skill would only work in the game, but he tries again to confirm, this time into an even farther trash basket. But his boss shows up right when he throws, and the paper ball hits him in the bulldog-like face. Everyone is shocked at what Howard did. His boss tells him to come to his office, and as he goes, several colleagues start talking bad about him behind his back. Only Donald looks worried. In the boss's office, they start talking, and the boss says he shouldn't have underestimated Howard. The protagonist is taken aback, but starts talking about being fired today and wanting to receive what's due. But the boss asks if he wants to leave like this, if he's forgetting something. Howard thinks he found out he talks badly about him online, but the boss is actually ecstatic and says he forgot to congratulate him for everything he taught Howard. He says the company's vice president will lead the new department and asks to have Howard on the team. That's why the boss is so friendly with the protagonist now. If he doesn't treat Howard well, he'll be out on the street. The tables have turned, folks. Donald is surprised at how the protagonist was transferred like this. While they're talking, the boss's brown nose comes to confront Howard, asking why Howard was called and he, as team leader, wasn't. But the boss's shadow appears, shouting at him to shut up, and he's also with the vice president introducing Mr. Liu. He asks if the guy doubts his ability to select employees. The brown nose apologizes and says he didn't mean that. The boss calls him a pig and says he won't be the team leader anymore. From now on, Donald will be, who promises to do a good job. Look at the idiotic face the brown nose makes. The boss also says Howard doesn't need to work today. He should pack up for the new job. Howard doesn't understand why he's being so flattered. The vice president also takes the opportunity to announce that there will be a party for the new department, and he should attend, also telling all employees that there won't be any layoffs and they should work properly. And as Mr. Liu is leaving, it's finally revealed in his thoughts that all this was asked by Sabrina. Donald is trying to manage his team, but no one is interested in what he's saying, and they say just because he's the leader now doesn't mean they'll work more just because he's saying. Outside the building, Howard is talking to his mother, saying that with the raise he'll be able to pay off the family's debt. He's interrupted by a beautiful woman, saying she's the leader of the new department team he'll be a part of. Her name is Sandy. Howard greets her, and when she mentions where the party will be, he thinks it's at the mansion where he lived with Sabrina, so she suggests they go together. As they walk, they hear someone screaming. It's people chasing a thief. Howard takes Sandy's bag and prepares to throw it, even though it's very far away. He hits the thief right in the leg as he jumps, causing him to fall face first onto the ground. While the victims hold the thief down, Howard picks up the papers that fell from the bag. He's worried that Sandy might not have liked him touching her bag, but she's all excited, saying he's amazing, that he hit the thief from afar, and if he can teach her to do that. As Howard gathers her things, he finds a card labeled Lawrence Enterprises, and Sandy explains that they're a business partner of their company, and that this Lawrence owns a company that's in the top 100 largest companies in the world. Howard says that name sounds familiar, and Sandy jokes about Sabrina dating the old man. Then he asks Sandy to hurry up, or they'll be late for the party, and says there's no point in him thinking about Sabrina because what happened in the game doesn't apply to real life. They arrive at the mansion, and Sandy starts asking a friend for directions to the party, but Howard just goes in because he knows the mansion like no one else. They arrive at the party, and Sandy's friends ask why she took so long, but she's impressed with Howard. In the middle of the party, Sabrina is with Mr. Lou. He says now that everyone's here, the party will begin. Sandy immediately hugs the protagonist, saying they'll sit together at a table, and Sabrina clearly looks uncomfortable. Mr. Lou begins a speech about how the company will conduct itself from now on, and Sandy explains that Sabrina is more powerful than Mr. Lou because she's the owner's daughter. Howard questions how Mr. Lou is the vice president being so young, and Sandy explains that he's been close to Sabrina since they were kids, and he was a prodigy at a prestigious university. Mr. Lou says the boring part is over, and now it's time for music and dinner. He invites Sabrina to dance, and she accepts, saying the last time they danced was in high school. Now it's Howard who feels uncomfortable. What a situation, guys. It must be tough for both of them. Dinner arrives, and Sandy says this steak must be worth their salary. They toast while he watches Sabrina dance, and Sabrina also sneaks a glance at him while dancing. Howard overhears some guests commenting that Sabrina and Mr. Lou would make a beautiful couple, besides being childhood friends, and the protagonist thinks that Sabrina could be happy with this guy. While pondering this, Howard gets distracted and burns his hand on the hot steak. Sandy gets up and pours cold water on the protagonist's hand. She says the burn isn't serious, and Howard feels embarrassed with her so close. Partygoers start commenting on the two of them being a couple, and Sabrina also hears the comments. She looks in their direction with a sad expression, and even Lou notices that she's upset. Suddenly, a guy appears saying that Sabrina is having fun. He wants to know why Sabrina, who is engaged to Lawrence, is dancing with another guy. Howard asks Sandy who the guy is, and she says his name is Hans, and he works at Lawrence's company. The protagonist tries to disguise when he hears Sabrina's fiancé's name, as if he had no idea who he is. Lou explains to Hans that he was dancing with Sabrina to liven up the party, and Sabrina thanks Hans for coming but says it's an internal company gathering. As she speaks, the guy stares at her cleavage, and Sabrina asks him to leave. He pays no attention and invites himself to the party, also inviting Sabrina to dance with him. Lou tries to push the guy away, saying they're not even close enough to dance, but Hans says it's not Lou's job to say such things. At the table, Sandy notices that the atmosphere isn't good, and they might end up arguing if it continues. To avoid further discussions, Sabrina agrees to dance with Hans. In the middle of the dance, he says he'll be responsible for taking the girl to her fiancé since it's a long-distance relationship. She thanks him, and Hans shamelessly starts getting closer to her body. Sabrina stops dancing and tells Hans not to touch her like that. He agrees, but internally thinks of her as just another girl. Sandy comments that Mr. Lou must be hating to see Sabrina going through this, but can't do anything because he has much less power than Lawrence. The protagonist watches as Hans begins to grope Sabrina, until she holds his hand and says they'd better stop dancing. Even Sandy, who is just watching, feels embarrassed by Hans's behavior, but he doesn't stop. He purposely steps on Sabrina's dress, causing her to lose her balance, and the strap of her dress tears. Mr. Lou gets angry but does nothing out of fear of Lawrence, and it seems like Howard is going to take action. The sun is setting, and out of nowhere, a steak comes flying. The piece of meat hits Hans right in the eyes, and he starts screaming that his eyes are burning, while Sabrina holds her dress to avoid exposing her breasts. The party guests notice what happened to Sabrina but don't pay attention to Hans, who becomes even more irritated. The guy orders his assistants to find out who threw the steak at him. One of them goes to Howard's table, takes a look at the dishes on the table but finds nothing suspicious, as he sees 2 steaks there. The protagonist becomes apprehensive with the guy so close to him and thanks Sandy right after throwing it. He was lucky that Sandy put half of her steak on his plate. She says you're welcome and thinks the protagonist was very bold to do that. Hans's assistants return saying they didn't find who threw the steak. The guy doesn't accept the explanation, shouting that nobody will leave until he finds out who did it, until he gets slapped in the face. The slap is so strong that it knocks Hans to the ground. After slapping him, Sabrina orders him and his colleagues to disappear from there. Her firm attitude surprises all the guests. Even Howard is startled and thinks he was lucky not to get hit by her in the game. Hans keeps saying that Sabrina dared to hit him, and behind Sabrina, Lou becomes brave and says that if Hans doesn't leave, he will call the police on him. Not even with the threat does Hans back down, so one of his employees says something in his ear, and this time Hans decides to leave the party. Lou asks Sabrina why Hans suddenly changed his mind, and she is just relieved that they left and will change clothes. Howard watches from afar as Sabrina leaves the party, and Sandy is staring at Howard from the other side of the table. He thinks they've already ordered too many drinks, and it's better to leave, but Sandy has other plans since she found the protagonist more charming than Lou. In fact, Howard is not worried about how much they have drunk but rather about his bank account. He only has a few dollars left, and it's still a week until he gets paid. Since Sandy has no idea about this, she doesn't want to stop drinking, saying that for every 3 glasses she drinks, Howard has to take 1. The idea seems good to the protagonist because that way he can make her drink more and eat less. Sometime later, Sandy falls asleep from drinking too much, and Howard tries to wake her up, asking her where she lives. She wakes up and starts saying some nonsensical things, dancing, but she's still very drunk and falls on top of Howard. The protagonist asks her to get off him because there are people watching, but the girl starts hitting on him. Before she could go any further, the waiter brings the bill. When the protagonist looks at the amount, he realizes he will be penniless until payday. He could have thought about splitting this bill. Now, the two are climbing the stairs of a building. Howard is taking Sandy to his apartment, and the girl says he's a jerk for doing this on their first date. But since she doesn't say where she lives and Howard doesn't have money to pay for a hotel, this is the only solution. A guy passes behind them and looks at them, very suspicious. The protagonist puts Sandy to bed, and she asks to be hugged, but Howard backs away, telling her to sleep. He doesn't want to be the subject of office gossip. Sandy knows she hasn't recovered yet, but she hasn't given up on the protagonist yet. She manages to get up a bit, and Howard asks her what she wants, and Sandy throws herself at him. She wants to conquer the protagonist before she falls asleep. Even though he likes what he sees, he holds Sandy's hand and says it will be a disaster if they go all the way. The girl doesn't listen and continues to approach. If it continues like this, Howard won't be able to control himself, but she stops. And when he looks at her, the protagonist sees that Sandy has fallen asleep. She belches in his face, and the smell is so strong that Howard sobers up. He puts Sandy back in bed once again and goes to sleep on the couch. Someone opens the apartment door, and Howard wakes up with light shining on his face. He gets up and sees that a guy has entered his apartment. The guy goes straight to the room where Sandy is sleeping and stares at her. Howard appears in the bedroom door, asking the guy what he's doing and how he got in there. The guy tells the protagonist to speak lower and says it's his turn to have fun with the girl. Howard is shocked by the response and grabs the guy, telling him to leave the apartment, but the guy retaliates and throws the protagonist to the ground. The guy focuses on Sandy again and says he owes the protagonist a favor. Since they're both men, he thinks the protagonist will understand him. There's something wrong with this guy. And of course, Howard doesn't understand the guy. He grabs a chair and uses it to attack the intruder, but the guy manages to break the chair with one punch, effortlessly. The guy says, convinced that people would do anything for a favor from him. Knowing he can't beat him in a fight, Howard decides to call the police, and the guy thinks it's unnecessary. After everything the guy did, it's more than necessary for the protagonist to call the police. And seeing him pick up his phone, the guy panics and tries to take Howard's phone. He thought the girl was there to work, and after understanding that wasn't the case, he's shocked to know people do such things on the first date. Now, The guy tries to explain that he's been away for 20 years and has no idea how people behave nowadays. But if that's the case, Howard wants to know why the guy stayed at his door instead of going home. The guy explains that he used to live in that apartment before the protagonist and came back to get some things he hid. He starts walking around the apartment and removes a piece of the floor. He takes out a box that was hidden and shows that inside it there were several jewels. This doesn't matter much to the protagonist, who wants to know how the guy will compensate for what he did, but the guy thinks it was all just a misunderstanding. He introduces himself as Josh, says he's not a good person, and he's leaving. The protagonist still thinks it's better to call the police, but Josh says it's better not to provoke him. Josh hands a box to the protagonist, and Howard thinks he's being bribed, but according to the guy, it's just an iron ring that isn't worth much. According to Josh, since he took the ring, he had been dreaming of a woman. She wore a red coat, held a golden scepter, and had eyes that shone in blue. He even tried to approach her but ended up being beaten by her. The protagonist thinks that, by the description, she looks a lot like AI-63. The guy leaves, and Howard stares at the box. Before Josh leaves, Howard asks if the guy really thinks that's a bribe, but he doesn't say anything and leaves. The protagonist wonders if that box could have any relation to the game, and when he opens it, he sees a ring with a red stone inside it. The stone seems to have made some connection with the system through Howard's eye, and a light emanates from the box. A hologram very similar to AI-63 appears and claims to be the developer of the Dream system, bringing a warning message for whoever tests the system. The hologram states that the person has fallen into a trap, leaving Howard shocked upon hearing this. It continues, saying that the game can make the person confuse what is real and socially acceptable. Their mentality changes without them noticing, and when they return to reality, they cannot differentiate between what is real and the game, often committing obscure acts. Despite the developers' protests, the game's financiers like this. The hologram urges the person to be attentive to the changes and not to be swayed by impulses, mentioning that she left communication devices scattered throughout the game's challenges to help the user escape the system, and asks the protagonist to come to her. The message ends, and the protagonist thinks that the developer resembles AI-63, but he doesn't think he would do anything out of the ordinary. He wonders if Josh met AI-63 20 years ago, and he only learned about the game after moving into the apartment. Perhaps the ring has some connection to the system. The protagonist continues holding the box when his phone rings. He stayed up all night and now has to work again. Sandy also wakes up due to the noise, and by the way she's dressed, she definitely thinks something happened between her and the protagonist during the night. They both go to buy breakfast at the stall together. The owner is happy for Howard to have someone, and doesn't even charge for the purchase. Howard doesn't seem thrilled about the relationship, while Sandy clings to him. The protagonist wonders why this is happening to him. This guy doesn't know how to be happy. Arriving at the company, people look at the new couple and comment that the former group leader had his eye on Sandy, and it's strange that she ended up with Howard, who was a stranger. He overhears and isn't happy to hear this. The couple enters the elevator, and Sandy is planning what they will do after work, but the protagonist thinks he doesn't have money and will have to borrow from Donald. Sandy also suggests they stop at a pharmacy to buy some things, and just then, the elevator opens, and Howard freezes upon seeing who is entering. Sabrina appears at the elevator door and greets the two as she enters. Howard is embarrassed by the situation, and Sabrina remarks that the two have progressed quickly in their relationship. Sandy expresses regret that Sabrina overheard about them and says they are embarrassed, but Sabrina continues to express surprise at how fast Howard is moving, leaving him speechless. Sandy keeps talking, mentioning she made it easy for Howard, thinking he was a gentleman. Howard covers her mouth before she goes into details, but the gesture only makes Sabrina think the two are very close. Sabrina congratulates them before leaving the elevator, asking them to act professionally in the office. When Sabrina exits the elevator, she appears very sad. It must have been difficult for her to wish happiness to the couple. Inside the elevator, Sandy criticizes Sabrina for asking them to act discreetly at work, and Howard also thinks it's better for them to be professional while working. Sandy lets go of Howard's arm and starts throwing a tantrum, saying he's not supporting her. She wants unconditional support, and asks if the protagonist has ever thought about starting a family with her. Talking about family makes him think, and Howard decides he should prioritize his relationship with Sandy. Sandy hugs Howard and says she'll wait for him after work. Before leaving, she mentions that the protagonist could be a bit more aggressive. In Sabrina's office, Mr. Liu remarks that she's overexerting herself, as she doesn't even have time for lunch. According to Sabrina, she's too busy with the new department, but for Mr. Liu, who knows her well, this is just an excuse because she's anxious. He leans on Sabrina's desk and asks if Howard is the reason she's feeling this way. Sabrina is shocked but denies knowing what he's talking about. Mr. Liu looks back, and Howard is entering the room. He mentions he has finished a task, and Mr. Liu asks the protagonist to show his work. Facing Howard, Sabrina tries to avoid eye contact. Mr. Liu evaluates Howard's work, and neither the protagonist nor Sabrina can look at each other. Sensing this, Mr. Liu asks what Howard is thinking about, and the protagonist explains that he was looking at a plant, examining the seedling on Sabrina's desk. His heart races as he asks if it's a tomato plant in the pot. Sabrina's hands tremble. She looks at Howard after hearing the question and says he seems to know about tomato plants. The protagonist claims he knows these plants well, while recalling Sabrina growing tomatoes in the game. She appears moved and asks if he has seen these plants somewhere before. He says he has, and his heart tightens as he remembers AI-63's warning that everything he experienced was a game, the developer's warnings, and his new girlfriend. He recalls Sabrina smiling at him in the game, but ultimately lies that he saw tomato plants in his hometown. Mr. Liu asks why Sabrina is growing tomatoes in the office, and Sabrina seems disappointed, but quickly changes her expression and says she must have planted the wrong seeds. In the bathroom, Howard washes his face, trying to stop thinking about Sabrina. He still can't separate Sabrina from her game counterpart in reality. In her office, Sabrina is relieved to have disguised that she remembers the protagonist. Still in the bathroom, Howard realizes he has already fallen into the game's trap and focuses on getting Sabrina out of his head. Holding the tomato plant, Sabrina also decides she needs to forget about what she experienced with Howard. From now on, they will live as if they don't know each other. Donald lends money to Howard, saying that now his friend's expenses have increased. At the end of the day, Sandy is waiting for Howard. He has decided to take his girlfriend out to dinner and make her happy, but when he steps out, he sees her talking to the former team leader. The guy claims to be concerned about her, and the protagonist joins the conversation, wanting to know what's going on. Howard asks if she's okay, and the other guy says that, unlike the protagonist, he's honest and leaves after saying what he wanted to her. The protagonist tells Sandy to ignore the guy, but she seems shaken by what he said. She lets go of Howard's hand and says she wants to break up with him. Sandy explains that they don't know each other well and asks about the value of his family's debt. The protagonist calmly says it's $200,000 and Sandy panics. The debt is much larger than she had imagined. She thinks it's best for them to go their separate ways. Sandy isn't from a wealthy family and assumes she realized the protagonist wasn't really interested in her. She only wanted to be with him because she hated how Sabrina always attracted guys. Sandy confesses that she doesn't deserve such a good guy and asks him to forget about the previous night. Howard thinks it's not the first time a girl has left him. His first love also left him for the same reason. On his way home, he's embarrassed by his debts and doesn't know how he's going to pay off everything he owes. When he opens the door to his apartment, the protagonist realizes something is wrong. There's a pot on the stove, and Josh is on his couch, all beaten up. After the day he's had, Howard loses control and grabs Josh by the neck. He can't stand the guy invading his home and using his things. Josh begs to stay at the house for a few days. He has nowhere else to go and was beaten up when he tried to get a job, but the protagonist has no pity and kicks him out. Alone at home, Howard goes to see what the guy was cooking. When he opens the pot, there are some mushrooms floating in a strange broth that doesn't seem edible. The protagonist tells the homeless man to come back inside, and Josh is apprehensive about the change of heart. Howard says Josh's food was incredible. It's as if he had eaten something prepared by a chef, and the guy says he knows how to make some dishes. Now, the protagonist wants to know how the guy couldn't get a job and still got beaten up, even though he's so talented. Josh explains that he's an ex-convict. He doesn't know how to deal with technology or make a decent resume. So Howard invites Josh to open a restaurant, and the guy agrees if the protagonist doesn't mind his criminal record. Howard gets up, saying he'll look for a place to rent, but Josh asks if he's sure because his criminal record is pretty bad. That doesn't seem to matter to the protagonist. He'll do anything to see his family standing tall again, even if it means trusting someone like Josh. The protagonist asks for some of the money Josh had hidden in the apartment to rent a place, but the guy spent everything he had on his girlfriends, ruining Howard's idea of having some money to start the business. Howard's phone rings, and he's surprised to see it's Sandy calling him. She says she's not a gold digger, and he wants to know why she's calling him. Sandy says she found a quick way to make money and asks if he's interested. Of course, he's more than interested. In Sabrina's office, Mr. Liu begins to comment on Howard. He is pleased that the protagonist managed to finish a week's work in just one day and produce quality work. He reveals that he thought Sabrina was having an affair with Howard but now understands that she just wanted to keep the good employees she had in the department. Sabrina forces a smile and says that her friend is not a saint and should change his secretary. Speaking of her, the girl appears, calling for Mr. Liu. Looking at the secretary, Sabrina remembers her father using this employee to teach spicy things to his daughter. Mr. Liu tells Sabrina that they have already agreed not to talk about each other's personal lives and leaves. The protagonist feels like an idiot for believing Sandy's idea. The girl introduces two friends, explaining that the three of them do live streams of a different kind from the conventional. Just by looking at how they are dressed, the protagonist notices that there is something strange and asks why they are dressed like that. They dress like this to attract more attention and thus attract more viewers, which means more money. One of the girls, Flatty, explains that the protagonist will have to wear the clothes they prepared for him and throw darts. Sandy offers Howard half of what they earn tonight. It seems that it will depend on the protagonist whether the live stream will catch the public's attention or not. Desperate to earn some extra money, the protagonist is willing to do anything. Flatty wants to know why Sandy called Howard to participate. It seems that, given the kind of things they do, this won't be very exciting. Sandy says it would be good to do something new, and the other girl begins to complain that Sandy is not the owner of the channel to decide things alone. She thinks it's better for them to do something more thrilling with Howard. The three look when the protagonist finishes dressing. He is wearing some very exotic clothes. It seems that the content they produce is indeed quite different. Flatty thinks the outfit looks perfect on the protagonist, just didn't like the mask much. Chubby believes Howard covered his face out of embarrassment for wearing such clothes. Clearly, he wouldn't want to be recognized dressed like that. Sandy explains to the protagonist that there's been a change of plans. They're going to add an electric mesh to the show. It seems Howard's reactions to the shocks will draw attention. Sandy tries to reassure the protagonist that it's safe, and Howard is determined to endure this embarrassment for money. The girls start the live stream, introducing a new challenge, shooting darts at an electrified coating. If the protagonist misses the target, he'll get a shock, and to demonstrate the intensity, Chubby throws a piece of meat on the floor, which gets toasted when it hits the net. Definitely not safe. Finally, she introduces who will take on the challenge. The protagonist, looking very unhappy in his leather outfit. Chubby says the protagonist will throw 10 darts and asks the audience to send virtual gifts to support him. As the girls watch the viewer count rise, Sandy tries to lower the voltage of the net, worried about the protagonist. But Chubby holds Sandy's hand, making her angry because she doesn't want to lie to the audience. This girl doesn't care at all about Howard's safety. Sandy says Howard could get hurt, but Chubby starts yelling on the live stream that people risk their lives every day, and she won't deceive their viewers. She says the protagonist also has to make an effort. If he's going to be a hindrance, he should leave. Howard then raises a dart ready to throw, narrowly missing Chubby's head. It could have hit her face. He hits the target on the first try and asks if that's enough. Chubby is surprised and decides to increase the challenge. Sandy protests that Howard is already far from the target, but her friend doesn't care. She just wants to increase the audience. The protagonist continues hitting the target, even from a greater distance, managing to hit 7 darts on target. This significantly boosts followers and views until the protagonist approaches the studio door and throws the remaining darts on the ground, telling the camera he doesn't like acting and that many people were only watching because they thought he would fail. The girls are shocked by what he said, and the protagonist says this may have been his first and last live stream and leaves the room. The girls complain that they worked hard, and the live stream ended like this, but it was the protagonist who did all the work. Suddenly, something shocking happens on their channel. The next day, They call Howard and tell him he's gone viral. Howard thinks it's all nonsense. He doesn't want to be popular with people seeing funny pictures of him. The protagonist is surprised when he leaves his room. Josh has prepared a full breakfast for him, already planning the restaurant's menu. The protagonist says he doesn't like the look of those dishes much. Also, there's no rush because it will take some time to open the restaurant. Howard just needs to raise the necessary money, and in the meantime, Josh can stay at his house. Howard arrives at the company, and Sandy and the girls are waiting for him at the door. They try to talk to the protagonist, but he says he has to work and avoids them. He's decided not to meet with them anymore. In the office, a colleague says Mr. Liu wants to talk to Howard, and the protagonist realizes his colleagues are watching videos. The guy says he's watching Brother 7, who is so popular that even Mr. Liu liked him. Brother 7 is none other than the protagonist in costume, and Howard asks if the character wasn't called Slanty. It seems that since he hit 7 darts, he's been called Brother 7. Howard goes to Mr. Liu's office and is pressured by the boss. Mr. Liu knows the protagonist and Sandy were on the live stream and wants to know why they didn't show up. It seems Mr. Liu found Brother 7 very charming. Mr. Liu wants Brother 7's contact and says the character dresses well and is admired by people. Mr. Liu wants Howard to get Brother 7's contact at all costs. He has plans to make money with the character, and also offers Howard a new position with a much better salary. Since he still needs money, the protagonist agrees to Mr. Liu's request. The girls are waiting to meet with the protagonist, who is late, until Sandy says he's arrived, and Chubby runs toward Howard, telling him that she used to make fitness videos, but no one paid attention until she made herself look ugly and did silly things. She begs not to be humiliated making videos anymore, just to earn a decent living, and the protagonist holds her hand, willing to continue making videos with them. After a month, the system notifies that the next dream will begin in a day, but he's no longer eager for the dream world. Now, he also finds the real world fun. The protagonist continues to make his presentations, and Sandy also appears to cheer up the viewers. Howard throws pies in the audience's faces, which pleases them, and they get excited shouting the protagonist's name. Sabrina is the only one who doesn't like the presentation, even though Mr. Lee says they'll make a lot of money from it. Chubby introduces the protagonist's show, and Mr. Lee gets excited to participate. The only one not convinced of the protagonist's popularity is Sabrina. After the presentation, Mr. Lee comments that Howard has disappeared, and the protagonist, disguised, reveals that he prefers not to work for Sabrina's company. This disappoints Mr. Liu, and before he could say anything, an old acquaintance returns. Hans appears, saying that his company would be a much better choice, but the protagonist also rejects the offer. Unconvinced, Hans offers 5 times more than Mr. Liu had offered. To Sabrina, this is a typical tactic of someone like Hans. The protagonist explains that he will decline the offer because he hates Hans, leaving him speechless. After this, Sabrina thinks that the protagonist is better than she thought. Josh is surprised that the protagonists managed to get money to start their business so quickly. In fact, part of that money was saved by Howard's parents, despite their large debt, and that money means a lot to the protagonist. Josh reveals that he won't be starting the business with Howard anymore, leaving Howard puzzled. His colleague explains that he found another job and it's better for Howard to keep the money. The protagonist's former colleague reveals to Hans that it's Howard who's been doing the presentations in disguise. Hans talks to his colleague about someone he knows who recently got out of prison, and the guy says that if they give money to this person, he'll do whatever they ask in return. Looking at a photo of the protagonist, Hans is planning his revenge. The protagonist appears injured and sinking, wondering if this is how he's going to die. Just a few hours ago, he was whole, and an unfamiliar woman was knocking on his door. The protagonist meets with Mr. Liu and talks about his roommate. Mr. Liu says that soon Howard won't need to share the room anymore since he's getting a raise, and introduces his driver and secretary, both familiar to Sabrina's memories. The protagonist asks where they're going, and according to Mr. Lee, they are meeting a powerful woman. The woman appears and disagrees with something, leaving Sabrina and her team disappointed. Howard and Mr. Lee arrive, and Sabrina asks why the protagonist came to a business meeting. Mr. Lee explains that Howard is now his assistant, and will introduce him to Mrs. Sharon, the CEO of a large company. The protagonist tries to introduce himself, but the woman pays him no attention. From what Mr. Lee says, she's always like this. Her company is the largest in the country, and they need to form a partnership, or else they won't be able to increase the company's profits. If that happens, Sabrina will lose the bet she made with headquarters, and he'll never see her again. The protagonist remembers Sabrina talking about her goals in the game, and wonders why Mr. Liu said he wouldn't see Sabrina again if she lost the bet. Mr. Liu wants to try another meeting with Sharon. She holds grudges against Sabrina's father, so the young woman thinks it's useless to try again, believing that there are only 3 days left until the end of the bet. Sharon's company is the only solution Mr. Liu can think of. As if things weren't bad enough, Hans appears, saying he will take Sabrina to Lawrence's house. Mr. Liu intervenes, saying that Sabrina hasn't lost the bet yet, but Hans insists that Sabrina must meet Lawrence to get married as soon as possible to accelerate the cooperation between the companies. The girl is disappointed but agrees to go with him. Watching this, Howard thinks that the marriage is just a form of negotiation. Mr. Liu doesn't think Sabrina's father would agree to this, but according to Hans, this is the only way to save the company. Putting everything together, the protagonist concludes that Sabrina must have bet her performance at work, and if she didn't reach the goal, she would have to marry Lawrence, the super rich guy who might even be in another country. Sabrina asks Mr. Liu to stop arguing because she knows how her father operates, always manipulating and deciding her future. Mr. Liu asks the protagonist to go back home and leaves with Sabrina, while Hans laughs, saying she deserves to lose the bet. Howard's phone rings, and Flatty says that haters have started spreading rumors that their show is a cult, but for now, there's nothing they can do. It's obvious who did this, and Hans makes a point of saying it's just the beginning, revealing that he knows about the protagonist's disguise. By the poolside, Howard has no idea what Hans intends to do, and thinking about Sabrina's situation, he decides to talk to Sharon again. Then, a man approaches him. It's Josh, who says he was paid to kill a man and apologizes to the protagonist, who falls into the pool injured, wondering if he will die. Sharon reaches out to help him. The game says the character was created, and the protagonist wakes up greeted by AI-63 to start the Frankenstein Invasion Challenge. He asks if he's still alive, and according to AI-63, the dead don't enter the game, so he asks if his life was in danger. Reflecting on what happened, Howard remembers Josh saying it wasn't a fatal wound but that he needed to get to a hospital quickly. If he didn't disappear, both he and the people around him would end up in graves, and the protagonist wonders why everything has to be so hard for him. With no choice, he decides to face the game. Before going, AI-63 warns that it's better to take some tools or he'll die quickly, but he ignores it. This time, he will train intensely to become a better fighter. Starting the Frankenstein Invasion Challenge, he is in the role of a surviving warrior who needs to fight and explore, and has 180 days before destruction. With a bulletproof vest and a gun, the protagonist believes the challenge shouldn't be so difficult. A liquid splashes on his helmet, and as he looks for its source, he sees a giant gorilla devouring another soldier. Running for his life, he will have to fight against this type of monster this time. The protagonist enters a ruin to take cover and considers whether he should use his gun against the monster, which is coming toward him. Instead of the gun, the protagonist grabs a piece of iron and hits the ceiling with it, causing part of the structure to collapse on the gorilla. Under the rubble, Howard manages to hit the monster's eye with the iron tip. The gorilla screams in pain and runs away. The protagonist survived the first attack and emerges from the debris, thinking that he must be more careful from now on. He senses a presence and grabs another piece of iron to attack the new enemy, but it turns out to be CEO Sharon in front of him. The protagonist can't stop the attack and throws the iron, which luckily only hits her helmet. Howard asks if she's okay, and Sharon says the protagonist should be in the hospital. He doesn't understand what she means. Sharon explains that Howard broke into her room injured and then fell into the pool, so she called an ambulance. The protagonist thinks he must have gone to her room to ask for help, but at no point did the game start. He mentions waking up in the middle of the ruins and asks how she ended up there. Sharon doesn't know either. They both just appeared, like the protagonist did. He thanks her for saving him by calling the ambulance, and concludes that there's something wrong with this game. Sharon asks him to save those words for another time, and, since he's good at throwing things, he should be able to help her. The protagonist is confused by her request, and she shows him a distant city in ruins, asking if it looks familiar. Looking closely, Howard is surprised, realizing it's the ruin of the building where he works. Judging by the state of the building and others around it, Sharon says they must have traveled between 300 and 400 years in time. The water around them also looks caustic, and the sea level keeps rising. The protagonist understands that the world is ending. To Sharon, they aren't the only surviving humans, and she might find a habitable place. The only problem is the monsters, but if Howard works with her, she can lead while he takes care of their security. The protagonist asks if she's not afraid, considering that she's making plans after realizing they time traveled. Sharon tells him that survival is the only goal in this world. Walking in the middle of a desert, Sharon asks if Howard was a dart-throwing athlete, but he says it was just a hobby. He didn't expect her to remember his name, since she didn't pay attention when they first greeted each other. At that moment, he had no value to Sharon. After climbing a hill, the protagonist agrees that she's a good leader. They spot a kind of fortress, and Sharon says that one can only have friends after valuing oneself. Suddenly, the protagonist covers her mouth, and they hide in a ravine. Above them, a giant centipede is passing by. Howard grabs his gun and offers it to Sharon in case she needs to defend herself. She thanks him and says she'll help him if they're in danger. They reach the fortress after the protagonist makes sure there are no monsters nearby. The place is very clean, but it's strange that they haven't seen any humans, until Howard finds something that surprises him, a kind of military fortress. Sharon notices what appears to be an eagle's nest on top, although a nest shouldn't be that large. She barely finishes speaking when the protagonist tells her to move away. A giant, radioactive-looking eagle is attacking. Sharon tells the protagonist to hide, but he doesn't take a single step, only telling her to protect herself. She thinks he's crazy. There's no way he can kill a monster like that with pieces of iron, but that's exactly what he's planning. The protagonist remembers when Josh held a knife to his neck and he did nothing to defend himself, only listening to Josh talk about how easily he could be destroyed and how, even if he wanted to, Howard wouldn't be his boss. When this dream ends, the protagonist wants to remember at least how fearless and brave he can be. The eagle approaches, and Howard is ready to throw his iron darts. He starts throwing them one after another, and they all hit the winged monster precisely. Sharon watches the protagonist's feet in surprise, and the monster falls defeated to the ground. As the monster falls, a green liquid hits Howard, who screams in pain as if he's being burned. Sharon runs towards him, telling him not to touch the caustic liquid. When she gets close, it seems to be too late. Smoke is coming out of the protagonist's wounds, and he continues screaming in pain. Suddenly, the fortress makes a noise, and a robot emerges from it, saying it detected an injured human and activates its medical system. A needle appears on the robot's arm, and it injects it into the protagonist's back, who seems to be receiving an electric shock. With this, the robot runs out of energy and shuts down, and the protagonist also faints. Sometime later, the protagonist wakes up with strange hair and asks where they are. Sharon explains that they are in the fortress, and thanks to the robot's medication, his wounds have been healed. She plugged the robot into the socket, and hopes it can tell them about the place when it wakes up. The robot wakes up, alerting that there's a large, dirty area, and rushes to clean it up. It approaches the monster's remains and sets fire to the carcass. Sharon says the robot must have advanced technology, and there must be a code to activate it. She remembers the numbers written on its body and calls the robot 2003. When called, it stops autopilot and activates the smart program. From what it says, this robot has collected tons of garbage and has been attacked by hundreds of creatures. A blue light turns on in the robot, replacing the red one, and it says that humans left it behind because it didn't work hard enough. If it continues cleaning everything, humans will return one day. Sharon asks if the place is tidy because the robot cleans every day, and according to him, humans will come back when they know how clean the place is. His response leaves them both uneasy, and Sharon wants to know if the humans said where they were going. The robot explains that the humans said if they didn't return in a year, they had probably gone to paradise, which sounds like a good place to him. The poor robot even wanted to go to them but couldn't find paradise on the map and asks if they know where that place is. The protagonist thinks it's better for the robot not to know, and by now, those humans are probably dead. Sharon changes plans after learning there are no more humans and asks the robot to take her to the storage room. Watching how she adapts her plans, Howard thinks the girl is truly unshakable. In the warehouse, there are weapons but no ammunition, compressed energy bars, and a medicine called Medusa's Tears, used to heal wounds but harmful if used excessively. The protagonist is worried because that's what the robot used to heal him, but the robot explains he'll be fine. The only effect is that his hair grew. However, the medicine can't completely fix the nervous system, and humans who used too much ended up in a vegetative state. There's also a reservoir and a power supply center. Sharon asks why the robot didn't recharge if there was power, but he couldn't use those resources without permission. She says machines will always be machines and asks the robot to show the rest of the place. The girl can't understand the language people were using, and the robot arrives with a map for her. On the way, his wheel breaks, and he falls to the ground, needing good maintenance. Sharon doesn't try to help, she just asks if he can read what was written. The robot says humans use scribbles so all intelligent animals could understand their stories, and since the language wasn't recorded in him, he can't read it. These humans prepared for when their civilization wasn't there anymore. Observing the map, Sharon realizes they're on an island. The only island on Earth, so all mutant beasts gathered there. But in 179 days, it will sink too. The only way to survive is to stay in the shelter. Sharon concludes they have no ammunition or food. Outside is full of monsters, and the only thing they can do is wait for death in the shelter. The girl definitely hasn't given up. She asks if there are any spare clothes to give to Howard, and the robot says he can take the clothes himself. Passing over the robot, Sharon explains he was left because he didn't know how to show how valuable he was to the humans, and doesn't want to end up the same way. Howard senses a presence behind him and turning around sees the robot asking not to be left behind. He pleads, saying he can still work clean, he just wants to stay with the humans. The robot remembers the time spent with humans and continues pleading that he's useful. Even without knowing what paradise is like, he'll make this place even cleaner than there. Howard lifts the robot and fits the piece that fell. He asks the robot how to fix it correctly, and the robot mentions a room where engineers used to repair robots. Howard says there are no engineers here, but he will try anyway. That's when he hears the door opening again, but this time it's Sharon who appears to take a shower too. She says the world is ending, so there's no need to be ashamed. Howard thanks Sharon for the clothes, and she tells him their situation isn't good, but they can still survive. She asks why humans would leave this safe place, and based on what Howard heard from 2003, they were looking for a place. Sharon explains that since the world will soon be destroyed, it would only be worth risking if they went somewhere that could protect them from destruction. She needs time to verify information from records, and with the sea level rising, monsters will gather on the island. Sharon hopes that they can continue working together, with her deciphering human language and him protecting them both. Howard is still surprised by how bold she is. He agrees to protect them both and notices she had a hidden weapon in her robe. He wonders if this is a female habit, since Sabrina did the same. Sharon is relieved he remained composed, as a mental breakdown would ruin their chances of survival. Howard wonders if she was considering threatening him if he didn't agree with her. She's not afraid of him, just afraid of losing her helper. It's amazing she's not shaken. Alone in the bathtub, Sharon thinks the protagonist is just an ordinary person and will be easy to deal with. Repairing the robot, Howard thought it was broken since it didn't say anything, but the robot explains it can't fully understand human language. Howard doesn't care what Sharon does as long as it doesn't interfere with his beast-killing training. The robot warns fighting beasts is dangerous, but Howard has no choice, having almost been destroyed by them in his own world. He vents about his problems, and how everything he achieved was crushed effortlessly by someone. For him, death is surrendering or fleeing, so he'll move forward. The robot asks if the other world would be paradise. Howard explains his paradise is being home. If he can overcome this challenge, he can save that home. The robot is excited to help and would like to heal him. Howard asks not to be called Master, unless it's a robot more like a girl. On the second day of the challenge, Sharon notices Howard has readied the robot, the closest thing to a warrior he has. The robot shows Howard the giant arrows humans used to use, placed in carts around the walls for defense against monsters. Leaving the warehouse, they encounter Sharon, and Howard explains he's going monster hunting, as agreed. Sharon finds it unnecessary. Records from 3 years ago showed too many monsters for Howard to handle. It's better he just keeps the place secure. With only 180 days, Howard doesn't want to wait for the monsters to attack. She says he's creating problems for himself. Even if he can kill the creatures, it's risky. They can't make mistakes until they find the sanctuary. Then they should be ready to fight with all their might. Howard gets irritated, asking if she's trying to dictate what he should do in his own world. He remembers many are trying to take his life and needs to get stronger. He doesn't care what happens to the world, and if she doesn't like it, she can leave anytime. Sharon likes his attitude and wishes him a safe journey. Howard leaves with the robot, thinking these NPC conversations are pointless. Sharon reflects that Howard doesn't seem like a mediocre man, but she has no idea what he's thinking. She feels haunted by a snake, a voice asking her worth, and she tells it to shut up. Instead, many voices call for her to join them. Sharon ties her hair back, trying not to think about the voices. She had another psychotic episode. She knows from past experiences that she'll die if she stays alone, and needs to improve her relationship with Howard. The robot notes Howard's tone was different, thinking if he had been firmer, he wouldn't have gone through so many bad things. After his first dream, he wrongly thought everyone was good. He remembers the woman who said Josh wasn't bad, but was with the wrong people again. Howard is determined not to create fantasies about human nature. Saving people is for heroes, which he is not. Even trying, the robot doesn't understand what he means. They encounter a mutant wolf pack. The robot warns of danger, but Howard wants to attack them immediately. He embodies his hunter self from before, needing to survive at all costs, and shoots the wolves one by one with arrows. The robot observes from afar as Howard fights mutant wolves. He's strong enough to take one down with his bare hands, but the wolf's corrosive blood splashes onto his hand. The robot warns against fighting unarmed, but Howard insists it's part of his training. In the distance, 2003 spots a shelter tent, and underneath it, they find a box also from the shelter. Inside is a cylinder of wheat seeds, and the robot reveals that wheat is the camp's symbol, named Wheat Shelter. There used to be several shelters, each with a function, but the advancement of corrosive waves turned them into wastelands. The functions of the shelters sound familiar to the protagonist, like a survival game where the player must explore and build. The robot reveals its cultivation ability. It can produce soil from rocks and fertilizer using beasts. Upon their return, Howard says they'll start cultivating in their spare time. 2003 is excited, but Howard acknowledges the plants will die when the corrosive ocean rises, believing it will help when humans return. AI63 mentioned the game's challenge is to see how humans' future can be improved, even though the protagonist won't be there to see it upon their return. The robot believes that if the shelter regains its glory, humans will surely return. Paradise doesn't compare to what the shelter once was, an irreplaceable place. Howard asks if the shelter was their home, and the robot confirms. After destroying more monsters, the robot warns that the protagonist's fight points have dropped. Howard doesn't understand, so the robot explains it calculates based on creature power and fight status. Howard peaked at 90 points and has been declining. He doesn't get it since he's winning fights, but according to the robot, his focus has shifted away from the fight, as if he's just releasing his anger. Howard thinks in real life, enemies are people and social pressure. Not everything can be solved with fists. The robot wishes Howard could make that world his home, but without his family, it can't truly be called home. Back at the shelter, Sharon praises Howard for bringing seeds, and he asks about the beast outside. She thought its body would attract more beasts, so she cleaned it. Howard is surprised by her diligence, and plans to hunt another beast for fertilizer the next day. He tries to bite into a food bar, but can't. His muscles may have been greatly affected by corrosive liquids. Howard gets the idea to soften it in water. Sharon definitely noticed something's wrong with him. The healing medicine is running out. Sharon suggests that Howard should go to other shelters and look for more, but the protagonist needs to prepare for such a journey. She offers him a pot of noodles made from the wheat, noticing he couldn't chew properly. Howard isn't pleased and asks if she used the seeds. She explains that she ground some of them into flour. The area therein isn't suitable for planting, and soon everything will be flooded. Howard didn't expect her to ruin the seeds so quickly, but he's used to facing problems before achieving anything. He refuses to eat and thinks it's better for her not to try solving problems without asking first. To her, Howard's farming idea seems crazy. Maybe the robots' attempt to win their sympathy is the problem. On the third day of the challenge, Howard is preparing to explore the abandoned camps. Then, Sharon appears, saying she found records that could improve the robot's functions. The protagonist wants to know if it really works, but that doesn't matter to her. The robot is old and not in good shape. Even if it fails, they can retrieve its data. When the chip breaks further, it won't even serve that purpose. Howard thinks the robot is loyal to them and should be treated better, but Sharon insists it's just a machine. She asks if he started seeing the robot as a friend, and the protagonist dislikes the girl's sarcastic tone. He's been friends with a tiger before, but since they have very different opinions, it's better they talk less to avoid arguments. This reaction from the protagonist makes Sharon think he's gone crazy. Then, the girl begins to have another episode, with voices calling her name and questioning her worth again, which is becoming more frequent. During the exploration, Howard and the robot encounter a group of vultures. They only attack if someone approaches their nest, so it's best for Howard to get rid of what's on the shelter soon. The robot explains that the rising ocean is due to human fights and suggests they stop fighting. Howard didn't know there was a hidden history about humans and is curious about why they fight. People started fighting over trivial reasons like race and did nothing, even as erosion increased. Then, Howard realizes his argument with Sharon was pointless. It's the protagonist's second time in the game, and he's learned that it's not worth holding a grudge against an NPC. They reach a forest area, and the robot reminds them that their goal is to reach an abandoned shelter. But Howard is focused on what might be in a truck protected by a beast. Not even the robot believes what he's saying. Only with a tank could Howard defeat a creature like that. The protagonist doesn't plan to fight alone and won't leave until he reaches his goal. The robot doesn't understand what he's thinking. Then, a blaze catches the attention of the beast. The robot is releasing fire to get its attention, and it works. The creature runs after him. Howard seizes the chance to see what the truck was carrying, luckily finding it loaded with supplies. Inside the crates are honey, musical instruments, weapons, and alcohol that Howard can use to make explosives. The most important item is a shiny stone and some cylinders with eggs that seem like they can hatch. Howard doesn't have a bag to store the items, so he must choose only a few that he can carry. The box containing the stone is too large, so he decides to take the jewel out of it. However, when he touches the gem, his hand gets covered in sand, and it starts to hiss. The protagonist is confused, and suddenly, the jewel flies out of his hand. It throws him to the ground upon impact, and even manages to move the truck. This naturally attracts the beast's attention, and Howard needs to run before getting caught. He dives into a crevice, but the stone is also heading in that direction. The truck with the stone inside crashes near the crevice and causes an explosion. As a result, various debris starts rolling, including Howard. He and the beast can barely hold on, narrowly avoiding falling into the corrosive ocean. Unfortunately, he realizes that the beast is unharmed. The green bubbles around its face ignite, and it shoots a corrosive jet from its eyes straight toward Howard. Smoke covers the area where he was, while the robot rushes to help him. Using the cylinder to shield himself, the protagonist applies all the medicine he brought since some of the liquid hit him. The beast looks at the corrosive rift it created, assuming Howard perished, and leaves. On the fourth day, the robot is by a campfire waiting for Howard to wake up. The protagonist finally awakens. It's the first time the robot has encountered a human with such strong will to survive. Howard mentions he's used to taking risks, but this attack was worse than the wolves from the previous dream. He asks about the red jewel, and the robot explains it's an energy core, the most precious thing in the world. Rubbing it with sand charges it with energy, and if rubbed too much, it explodes. The shelter's energy core works the same way. That's why there should be something protecting the jewel from dust. Howard asks if there are other items that could explode if he gets close, but the robot only warns that now that he's marked by the acidic liquid of the region's lizard leader, he could be attacked at any time. Howard realizes that the part hit by the acid has a different color. He's been marked by the beast. His left arm is numb, and he now has only one arm for accurate throws. He asks about the eggs he picked up, and the robot reveals that it took care of them. They are now incubating and puts them out. Howard asks if the shelter produced eggs, and according to the robot, they produced chickens, goats, and others. He still remembers the green mountains and the goats. Howard also feels nostalgic, remembering the roosters crowing in the morning in his village, even though as he grew up, he began to hate it and prefers to forget about the incident. Fear and longing mix in Howard's memories, and he agrees, saying he wants to reunite with his father. He wishes to pay off the family's debts and let his father rest in old age, but he doesn't have a way to do that yet. He also wanted to tell his mother to stop blaming herself for the debt and not worry about him, but he knows that's impossible now. After they got into debt, they blamed themselves. His dismissal or the live streams wouldn't have been problems for his parents, but seeing their son in the hospital would be devastating. The robot senses the protagonist's sadness and offers a hug. Howard is an adult who can handle stress, but he accepts the hug, revealing that his greatest advantage in the game is being the only human there. In real life, voicing complaints is shameful. Many hide their grievances, and they all need a hug. Howard puts sand inside the robot to protect the eggs until they reach the shelter. What's happening seems almost fun to Howard. He's doing things he wouldn't dare to in real life. He also asks how the robot lost the iron plates it welded onto itself. The robot had an intense fight with the vultures while Howard was asleep, and both got injured. The robot still can't believe it found humans again, and will be able to rebuild the shelter. It knows humans always like to lie, saying they would return or that no one would save them. Howard is at a loss for words, but the robot can consider him part of the family. This shocks the machine. It never had a family before. But the joy doesn't last long. They are on their way to the monster's lair. Right in front of them is a gigantic mutant gorilla. The robot says it's another dominant beast, attracted by sound, likely due to the previous explosion. The gorilla has entered the lizard's territory, and it won't end well when the lizard finds out. This will be good for Howard. He can go unnoticed while the two beasts fight and reach the shelter. Vultures are flying near the walls of the shelter. Howard realizes they were attacked, and the beast's nest that was above the shelter is on fire. An arrow flies close to him, hits the wall, and explodes shortly afterward. Then, Sharon appears from behind a wall and asks if he's okay. She was worried about him disappearing, but Howard thinks she aimed the arrow at him and asks if she killed the beasts on the ground and managed to burn the nest. While he was away, the beasts attacked, and she noticed the bird's interest in the nest, so she burned it. She also discovered about the energy core and cut pieces of it to make explosives. The only problem is that she gets very nervous when she shoots. This time, Howard acknowledges that she's amazing for doing all this, but she grabs his hand, asking him to stay in the shelter for a few more days. Sharon found out that humans probably fled to a place called Under the Moon. Since Howard is being pursued by the giant lizard, they wouldn't be able to reach that place. For now, it's better for her to protect the shelter while he fights this beast. The robot needs to recharge and put the eggs in the shelter's incubator, and Howard explains to Sharon about the eggs and asks her to take care of them when they hatch. Sharon agrees. Unexpectedly, she likes small animals. The protagonist notices she's different and asks if something happened while he was away, but she just says he doesn't need to worry. Sharon's explosive spears are very useful, although she has only a few. According to the robot's radar, none of the beasts chasing Howard have been seen so far, but its radar has a short range since it was used to track lost animals. Suddenly, the shelter is hit by something, and the power goes out. Howard thinks it's the lizard attacking, but the robot says its radar didn't detect anything. Then, Sharon appears, saying not to worry. The power room has a leak, although she doesn't know how that happened. The robot remembers that the eggs will spoil without the incubator running, but a pile of rubble is blocking their path to the eggs. Sharon warns that the power is back on, but it's too late. Only one egg survived in the incubator. Howard decides to put the eggs back in the robot's incubator, and Sharon doesn't like the idea, since only one survived. She says it was just an accident and will take care of them next time, but Howard explains that to the robot. The eggs weren't just eggs, they represented hope. This time, she doesn't hold back. Sharon shouts that the robot is just a machine. She wants that egg back. Howard thought they had started to understand each other, and the robot asks them not to fight. Then, its radar alerts. The lizard beast is nearby. Howard asks the robot to stay in the shelter to protect the eggs, but the robot wouldn't leave its family and goes along, so the protagonist asks it not to get involved in the fight. This definitely seems crazy to Sharon. Once again, she has an episode where the snake in her illusion says it will always be with her. Both of them run out of the wall, and the lizard is coming towards them. The protagonist's idea is to lead the beast to the mountains, far from the shelter. As they run through a crevice, the lizard follows them along the top of the valley. The lizard knows it would be at a disadvantage in the crevice, so it goes along the top. Howard decides to use the explosives and throws one towards the beast. The robot warns that the protagonist threw it too far from the target, but that was his intention. Howard wanted to buy time and asks how far the beast is. According to the robot, it has increased speed and can reach them at any moment. Soon, they'll be in open ground, and that's when the protagonist will create a mess. Howard continues to provoke explosions through the crevice. The robot warns that if they continue straight, they will reach the corrosive sea, so Howard asks it to turn right while buying time. Suddenly, they stop. The gorilla from the beginning of the game is in front of them, and right behind it is the lizard. Howard says the mountain to his right is very worn down and asks the robot to follow him. The protagonist is between the two beasts, fires the last spear, and asks the robot to run. The rocks explode, and the beasts fight each other, while the protagonist hides in the crevice he created in the rocks. The hole is fragile and won't last long. Outside, the gorilla is winning against the lizard until it spits a jet of corrosive liquid directly into the gorilla's mouth. The monster starts to regurgitate, and once again flees the fight. Howard doesn't miss the opportunity and throws a spear at the lizard, but realizes he won't have enough, so he gathers his strength and throws another one that hits the first and strikes its core. Unaware of the danger, the beast swallows the arrows, and nothing serious happens. Suddenly, its head explodes. The robot celebrates that Howard destroyed a dominant beast, while the protagonist complains that all he achieved in this game was sweat. He notices the robot has started shaking. It warns that the egg in its incubator is hatching. The weather suddenly changes. The protagonist asks the robot what's happening because the change doesn't seem normal. The annual farmer typhoon is coming. In the next 48 hours, there will be acid rain and sandstorms. Disasters start in 10 minutes, and the only thing possible in that time is to dig a hideout with the remaining bomb. Howard hears a familiar beep and asks if the robot hears it too, but it is focused on the hatching egg. Meanwhile, the sound becomes more frequent, and Howard knows somehow it represents danger. Then he remembers it's the sound of a time bomb in shooting games. Howard looks back and notices the lizard's body is covered in green bubbles, and the sound is coming from them. The bubbles burst, throwing the robot and the protagonist. Howard screams as his eye is hit by the green, corrosive liquid. Meanwhile, several vultures are coming toward him, attracted by the lizard's body. The protagonist uses the 3 medicine vials to heal himself, and a lot of smoke comes out of his body. He finds a fragment of the core, and before the vultures get close, he kicks the small vial that hits the rock and explodes, throwing him backward. The explosion creates a cave, and entering it is Howard's only chance to survive. The protagonist tries to reach the cave but is attacked by a vulture and is left almost powerless on the ground. Howard thinks he should have acted better and will die if he stays there. Another vulture tries to attack him, but this time the robot manages to pull him away. While pulling Howard, the robot injects a little more medicine into him. It manages to get him into the cave and runs to close the entrance before they are attacked again. The protagonist is disillusioned that he can still survive, but the robot says it will take care of him. Still, Howard thinks the robot should save itself. He's content that the robot and the chick survive. The robot wouldn't abandon its family and stays with Howard, who still thinks the game is over. Prolonging it would only cause suffering. To the protagonist, the robot would be fine outside. The birds are only interested in meat. Suddenly, a vulture's beak manages to pass through the sealed cave. The robot blocks it and offers safety and loyalty to the protagonist, who watches helplessly. It continues offering, even healing desperately. Howard remembers telling this to the robot when talking about home and asks it to stop. Then, the vulture's beak goes through the robot. Now even the robot's hope, the chick, is gone. With a hole right in the middle of it, the robot continues saying it doesn't lie and asks the protagonist not to go. It did its job the best it could, and a power shortage warning appears. The vulture attacks again. This time, the robot loses the top part, and Howard can only watch without being able to do anything. On the 6th day, the robot, almost destroyed, is dragging Howard. He asks if this is the end of the world, but it's what happens after the sandstorm. The robot will use its last strength to take him back to the shelter. The protagonist feels numb after taking so many injections and anesthetics, but as soon as he can move, he wants to fix the robot. However, it starts to crackle and catch fire, so he asks Howard how he plans to redesign the shelter before it stops working. The protagonist asks him to listen carefully. First, he will pave the path leading to the shelter, then he will plant aspen trees on both sides of the road. On the left side, there will be a wheat field, maybe plant corn too, and on the right side, he will plant flowers that bloom in the spring, creating a beautiful view. Further down the road, there will be a large carob tree that can be seen from afar. In moments when he felt lost and confused, or didn't know where he was going, he could stop and look back, knowing the tree would always be there, lit up in flames, serving as a lovely beacon to guide humans. The protagonist thinks he has been lost for too long. As they near the shelter, the robot detects a barrier around it. It switches back to automatic mode, talking about cleaning. If it keeps cleaning, humans will return. It heads towards the sign indicating buried mines, and the protagonist shouts for it to stop, but the robot recognizes him one last time. However, it doesn't stop and explodes. The protagonist is left on the ground, wondering why the world has to be so cruel to him. Howard tries to grab a piece of the remaining robot, but another hand also grabs it. Sharon takes the piece from the protagonist's hands and runs off without saying anything. On the 8th day, the protagonist wakes up in a room, gets up to get water, and memories of Sharon taking the piece return. He exits the room calling for Sharon, wanting to know why she turned against him. She is holding a drill and doesn't seem well. Howard finally finds her. She was rebuilding a robot, leaving the protagonist speechless. The robot is recovering memories and soon recognizes Howard. It asks if it has been fixed, as the protagonist thought it had been destroyed in the explosion. Sharon explains that the metal ring is the robot's control center, and if it's intact, the robot can be repaired. The robot is gleaming with its new parts, now equipped with a kitchen and combat system. It's excited, having become an elite robot. The protagonist is also impressed. It's like magic how it's good as new. Sharon had mentioned she could improve the robot. In the maintenance room, there are better parts than what Howard had used. Instead of trying to learn something, he just vented all his anger on the girl. Howard remembers her saying the robot could be destroyed during refinement. Sharon retorts that nothing has a 100% chance of success. He's being childish. If she hadn't fixed the robot, she would have to suffer its revenge. She's tired and thinks they should talk. She had to take measures to survive while he was away, and even with warnings, he stepped on mines. When she talks about science, he talks about feelings, and when he tries to make a plan, he leaves her alone. Every time something happens, Howard finds reasons to blame her. She doesn't know what she could have done wrong to act like this. The girl starts crying. She doesn't mean harm, just survival. Surprised, Howard apologizes for acting without thinking. The girl is leaving the room, and he asks her not to be angry. Before she goes, she says the robot needs to be powered by the energy core, and since he promised not to touch it, Howard needs to do that. The protagonist is confused by the girl's change, but thinks it's better to change his behavior. Alone, Sharon thinks Howard is stubborn but can't handle it when someone is harsh with him. She just played along with his game, but when the time comes, she'll be out of it. Meanwhile, Howard is confident in the game again, and the robot asks how he's doing after being hit by so much acid. Howard can move normally, but his hands won't stop trembling. It'll be hard to hit his targets. The robot says he doesn't need to worry. With the new combat chip, his combat power reaches 300. The power difference between them is too great, and Howard doesn't know if this score is reliable. The robot is confident it has inherited fighting powers from the peak of human civilization and demonstrates the moves it knows, impressing the protagonist. The protagonist swaps the robot's hands for boxing gloves.
Sign the contract, big boy!
He finds this function very convenient and wishes he had known about it earlier. Not everyone could change a robot, and he recalls Howard mentioning there was no engineer around. As far as the protagonist knew, Sharon was just a company leader without such technical training. Changing the subject, Howard decides to train in combat with the robot, and then test his skills against beasts. After learning something new, he expects to feel strong and brave again. But first, he'll get some energy core and paint to customize the robot. The robot wants the shelter's logo painted on it, rather than looking like just a waiter as before. Howard agrees and plans to place wheat flags everywhere, so the robot always feels at home. In the energy room, the robot seems to be exaggerating its power, given the size of the stone. A voice surprises Howard, asking why he's so late. The developer states that the core is crucial in the game, and players usually check it beforehand. She knows Howard hasn't forgotten their previous conversation and asks him to destroy the game. However, he asks her to calm down, as he's not ready for that yet. The developer warns Howard not to be swayed by desires, questioning if the laws are ready for the game's launch, as millions of players will gain real-life powers. She suggests that Howard can choose between being an unnamed hero or a sinner, and that they can stop everything before it's too late. She explains that the game's final reward is the ability to live forever. How many people would resist such temptation? Even the protagonist had never considered how fantastic the precise aiming ability he gained was. Together, they can stop all this before it's too late. The protagonist never wanted to be a hero. He's just an ordinary person but asks how he can help. He only has to take the core to a specific location, and then the developer will use system flaws to destroy the game. This location is dangerous, so it would be better to have enough weapons and a truck to transport the core. Howard wants to wait until the last month for this, as he wants to use his time there to learn something useful. The developer will get some things to help Howard on his journey but can wait a maximum of 3 months for the core to reach the specified location. After that, he can go to her to solidify his memories. When he wakes up, he will remember everything, including what he learned in the game. After their conversation, Howard paints the robot with the shelter's colors and logo, and energizes it with a core fragment. The developer also mentioned that Sharon had overused the core, so she had cut off the energy earlier. The robot asks why Howard seems sad again, but he says it's okay and that they should cherish the moments they have together. Howard wants to see how strong the robot's 300 combat points are, so the robot stands taller and punches the protagonist in the face. The opponent is concerned if he hit Howard too hard, but the protagonist thinks it's nothing compared to the sulfuric acid he faced. They continue the training, and Howard keeps losing the fight to the robot. The robot states that the protagonist only has 50 combat points unarmed, hence the machine's superiority. Then, Howard asks if the robot can calculate someone's value just from their description. He recounts how a guy alone, unarmed, defeated over 20 armed people. Based on what he heard, that's what Josh did. According to the robot's calculations, such a person would have at least 3,000 combat points. This leads the protagonist to think that someone so powerful could defeat even a mutant beast. But for the robot, there wouldn't be a human that strong. Howard remembers Josh saying he didn't want to harm his parents, or a man named Lao Tang. Still pondering, the protagonist asks if conquering the desert will reach 3,000 combat points. The robot concludes that after everything Howard has been through, he can do anything, and it will help. Thus, they restart the training. Meanwhile, Howard recalls his childhood in the village. The boy's life wasn't bad until his parents lost everything. After that, even young, Howard had to work. During that time, he accumulated many disappointments and feels he always ran away like a coward. Howard defeats some wolves after training and concludes that he won't bow down to anyone anymore. Howard continues to fight against the beasts. Meanwhile, the robot acts as a tutor to assist him in battles. Even with this help, the protagonist misses some hits and even falls face first on the ground. Then, the robot alerts that Howard is not fully recovered yet and should act with caution. It guides Howard to even use the strength of his fingers. With speed and precision, he can hit his opponent's vital points. The robot informs that the protagonist can defeat beasts with up to 100 strength points. If they are stronger than that, his hits won't work. Howard knows he's not in top physical shape, but he didn't expect to struggle so much against these monsters. Nevertheless, with hard work, they now have enough wheat to start rebuilding the shelter. The robot explains that before they start planting, they need to protect the area from the wind and fix the sand. Since the area around the shelter is taken care of, they just need to mix some lime into the soil and can use monsters as fertilizer. Because the shelter is focused on planting, there are several pieces that the robot can use for that. With the energy core recharged, it's now possible to work 24 hours every day. Howard asks if he can help his friend, but the robot thinks it's better for the protagonist to keep training. Sharon watches Howard train during the night. To her, the protagonist is pushing himself too hard, unnecessarily. She notices that his hands are still trembling, which must be an effect of the corrosion that hit him before. But Sharon's planning is over, and now she'll need his work. Exhausted from training, Howard falls asleep outside the shelter. He is awakened by Sharon, who says she has something for him. The protagonist is totally surprised by what he sees. Sharon has made an exoskeleton to help Howard fight after noticing his difficulties. She even says that this was easier than assembling a robot, as if it were something simple to do. Sharon knows that Howard won't stop fighting, so at least this way, he'll be safer, and taking advantage, she asks him for something. Sharon shows a map and asks for the items marked on the locations. The map is from 10 years ago and shows several abandoned shelters. Unfortunately, Sharon couldn't find details about the shelters in the records. Howard sees in the records that the combat value of a shelter is 100,000, meaning hand-to-hand combat is impossible. With the power of the monsters around, the protagonist will need more offensive capability. He decides to leave on the same day, and Sharon asks if he'll need anything for the journey. She also asks him to bring back some animal if he can. Before leaving, the protagonist prepares himself a bit, and decides to train while it's still morning with the robot. At the shelter, Sharon continues trying to learn more about that world. The computer tells her that today is the annual clock festival. It suggests they sing a masterpiece from ancestors 400 years ago. The lyrics say that when they find a new home among the stars, they will return to rescue their companions from the sea of suffering. Meanwhile, Howard and the robot arrive at the Museum of Ruins. Spending the day there, the protagonist asks if the robot won't talk about history. And that's exactly what it's going to do. The protagonist and Sharon learn that 400 years ago, before the radiation, humanity gathered in the face of an impending catastrophe and could build spaceships to escape the planet. But unfortunately, not everyone could go to space. So, when the radioactive meteor fell, those who survived dedicated themselves to passing down the history to future generations. They believe that one day, after finding a new home, those who went to space will return to rescue them. A century after the catastrophe, the radioactive beasts appeared. Initially, this wasn't a problem because humanity still had the power to destroy them with the remaining technology. But gradually, humanity began to divide again, for trivial reasons. The corrosive sea began to rise, but all they saw were their foolish disputes. And so, they kept losing themselves until reaching the current stage. After learning all this, Sharon thinks that if Howard is as foolish as those humans, they won't survive. The protagonist continues to fight against the mutant beasts in the Museum of Ruins. Inside the museum is a security robot that is activated when the fight gets too close to it. Our robot warns the protagonist that the other is a level C security robot. This robot lacks artificial intelligence and will destroy anything in its path. With the gloves that Sharon made, it will be much easier for Howard to fight against it. The protagonist remembers Sharon saying that the metal ring is the robot's CPU. In this case, it is located right in the opponent's chest. The protagonist manages to dodge the robot's first attack and approaches to remove the ring from its chest. Without much effort, Howard successfully removes the ring and defeats the security robot. Now, Howard and the robot can take a closer look at what is in this museum. The robot comments that Howard is getting smarter and that, with the gloves, he now has 200 combat points, which is still not enough for him. Opening a door, they find the skeleton of the old museum curator. Given its condition, the curator was not harmed, and the robot wonders why he stayed there. The protagonist realizes that the books are protected. They were taken care of by the curator. Upon closer inspection, the protagonist notices a book next to the skeleton. In the book are the flags of dozens of countries that no longer exist. The robot explains that these were the flags of the ancestors. The entire room has references to them, with several replicas of artworks on the walls, and the protagonist recognizes some of them. The robot realizes that Howard is a human from 400 years ago. It always thought that Howard was its contemporary who had lost memories. Curiously, the robot asks if the protagonist has ever seen cute animals like cats or dogs. After the meteor fell, people only cared about saving themselves, and the animals died of hunger. In fact, even before the meteor, global cooling and other catastrophes practically wiped out the animals. After hearing this, Howard asks how the robot knows so much about the past, as if it were scripted. Reading the rest of the museum curator's book, Howard realizes that the initial catastrophes resemble what happened in the first game. While he was fighting alone, humanity was coming together to build spaceships and escape the planet. It's like what IA-63 had said. The essence of the game was to see how humanity could improve the future with the player's help. Thus, the protagonist's actions can affect the future of that world. With only 80 days left in the game, Howard decides to try to reverse the catastrophic history of this world. Back at the shelter, Howard tells Sharon that he only found robot parts and asks if she can make a pet robot with them. They both analyze the book that was with the museum curator. Howard then asks the robot to tell her how the oceans were destroyed. Originally, there was no corrosive ocean. Gastric juice accumulated in the oceans due to mutant organisms, called sour ants. They turned the oceans into their habitat, reproducing rapidly and being able to dissolve everything with their digestive juice. Submarines and warships were swallowed, and within a few years, they became impossible to contain. When these ants finish digesting the Earth, it will be the end of the world. According to Sharon, that's precisely why they need to concentrate their resources and find shelter. Agreeing with the girl, Howard thinks it's best for them to join other refugees to prepare for this disaster. Thinking ahead, Sharon has already planned some steps. She shows a drawing of a satellite station. The plan is for Howard to collect the materials, Sharon to assemble them, and the robot to do the construction work. Suspicious of Sharon's goodwill, the protagonist asks if she's really offering help. Sharon says they've already talked about it, and it's better for them to focus on working together. All of this means a lot to Howard, and he thanks the girl. In her thoughts, Sharon reflects that the world is too divided, and it will be impossible for them all to work together. Even with a common goal, Sharon plans to separate from Howard after this. For Howard, escaping the imminent end means that real-life problems won't be impossible to solve either. Determined, he goes to the various regions Sharon marked on the map in search of resources, battling various beasts at each location. Meanwhile, Sharon and the robot assemble the materials the protagonists brought. After 2 weeks, their antenna is ready. Sharon plans to use this antenna to locate the Su-Moon shelter. Howard waits for good news and spends time with the robot. He found some trees in the shelters he visited, and the robot is excited about planting them. Nearby, Sharon thinks she will finally be able to leave this devastated land. Later, Sharon is trying to communicate using the antenna. We can see a satellite in space. Suddenly, the Su-Moon shelter makes contact, asking about her intentions. Sharon is surprised they initiated the conversation. She asks for help, saying she's trapped in the wheat shelter and wonders if someone could rescue her. The shelter replies that they don't do rescues and suggests she take an energy core and go to the launcher, where she might be able to save herself. Sharon doesn't quite understand what this launcher is. The shelter explains that it's not on Earth and asks her to change her perspective. In reality, the Su-Moon shelter is on the moon. What Sharon saw was just a satellite. The communication continues, and to make the trip, 1,000 kilograms of the energy core are needed as fuel. According to Sharon's calculations, the shelter's core weighs 1,100 kilograms, enough for only one of them to leave the planet. Sharon chooses herself and reserves a spot to use the launcher. The shelter confirms her reservation and looks forward to seeing her on the moon. Sharon sits next to Howard to observe the tree he planted. She mentions not finding the shelter, and Howard suggests it might be hidden somewhere. Sharon decides to search for the shelter again and asks if she can help him with anything, if he has any wishes or if there's something he's anxious or thinking about. The protagonist finds these questions a bit strange, as if she wants to hold on to his last words. But she explains that the end is near, so it's good to fulfill dreams before then. Talking about the end reminds Howard of what was happening before he came to this world. He was almost killed by his colleague. Hearing about this makes Sharon pensive. Howard comments that the blame for what happened lies with him. His partner couldn't wait to start a business with him, and he thinks he should have considered his needs. Howard tells Sharon not to be affected by the approaching end. Now that they are getting along, he will take care of her. The girl smiles and agrees with him. In front of the computer, Sharon receives the coordinates for the launcher. She just needs to get there before the final day. Before that, she has to solve 2 problems. First, build a powerful combat robot. Sharon knows that many escorts from the shelters were destroyed on the way, and the same will happen if she tries to go to the launcher alone. The second thing is to go to a dangerous abandoned shelter with the robot to get a special transport truck without Howard knowing. To build this combat robot, Sharon asks Howard to collect more materials for her, using the excuse that she will build a planter to help the robot. Sharon was in contact with the shelter until suddenly, the protagonist appears. Howard starts praising her for building the planter. For Sharon, Howard has completely changed from what he was before, and she wonders if he knows her secrets. Even as she works on building the robot, Howard shows up, offering her something to eat that he prepared. Accidentally, he spills water on the CPU she was working on, which infuriates Sharon. But she disguises it, and kindly says that he doesn't need to do these things for her. To Howard, she is now the team leader and deserves better treatment. He keeps doing things for her until Sharon can't control her irritation and tells him to stop. Sharon says he's being kind and must want something in return, since he's an adult, and they've been together all this time. The protagonist doesn't understand what she's saying. Sharon says he should have said something before. It's not like she never gave him a chance. Ashamed, Howard says that's not what he wanted. He didn't mean to scare her, and he shows her a box of sanitary pads he found. Since they've been there for almost a month, she might need them. This time, it's Sharon who feels ashamed of how she acted. She takes the box and says Howard can bring more whenever he finds them. Only in the bathroom can Sharon have peace without being interrupted. Looking at a map, the truck she needs is at the Oasis shelter. She thinks about how silly Howard is for not noticing that her robot is almost finished. He can plant as much as he wants at the shelter because soon she will be free from this place. Suddenly, the robot approaches from behind and puts a hood on Sharon. Shortly after, Howard grabs the girl and carries her somewhere. Sharon panics, thinking the protagonist might be planning something against her. When Howard finally takes the hood off Sharon, he tells her to look at all the work he's done. The girl is lost because she was taken outside the shelter and is in the middle of nowhere. Howard explains that thanks to her, the machines are working more efficiently, so she deserves the best treatment. Thus, she realizes he still doesn't know about her plan, which she feared he had discovered. The protagonist managed to turn the soil, which was just sand, into fertile soil, and he wants to show his baby to her. Sharon doesn't seem interested in what he wants to show, but Howard, very excited, doesn't realize and shows her a sprout. Sharon asks if he brought her there as a kidnapper just to show bean sprouts. According to him, this is just the first step. The planter is continuously putting seeds into the soil. In the future, the mountains will be full of plants. Even people not on the ground will see that it's returned to normal. He wants to reignite people's passion and make them come back to fight for their planet. So, Sharon asks him an important question. Will there be enough water for all these plants? Howard is speechless. He hadn't thought about that. Howard says that originally his idea was to bring Sharon outdoors a bit because he was concerned that she had spent too much time in the shelter lately, thinking and studying. Sharon is somewhat surprised by Howard's sudden concern. He surprises her with a cake, saying it's a surprise he and the robot prepared. Howard apologizes for having explored the area so much, causing her to become isolated in the shelter. He then finishes by saying that if she has anything to say or complain about, they can talk peacefully, but she says it's okay. Suddenly, a creature appears out of nowhere and jumps on them. Amazingly, the creature lands on the cake, splattering cake on both of them. Luckily, Howard wears an eye patch now. He starts chasing the monster, while the robot yells not to ruin their crops. Sharon is very irritated with her face covered in cake, thinking that she doesn't want to stay here for anything in the world. When Howard catches up to the creature, he is astonished by what he sees. A tree he planted just a few days ago is already taller than him. Around the tree is a kind of raccoon holding some white balls in its paws. The robot tells Howard that this is a powerful chemical fertilizer, but Howard could already tell by the smell of the balls. The creature seems to ask Howard to follow it, and Howard thinks there might be more of this fertilizer where the creature wants him to go. Cut to day 35, as we see Sharon tightening a screw. She's in that psychosis again, saying that it's been days since Howard went after the raccoon and still hasn't returned. We see that the screw was the last piece of the robot she just finished building to escape this place. Next, we see her in a dark and frightened place, with faces of evil people saying all kinds of bad things to her. But it was just another one of her crazy dreams. She's in a jeep on her way to another shelter in search of something. The autopilot announces that they've reached the destination known as the Oasis. The front door seems to be torn and open as she and the new robot analyze from afar. But she enters without fear, saying she trusts no one but herself. As she walks through the corridors of this shelter, Sharon encounters monsters on the floor, making her uneasy and telling her robot to enter guard mode. At the end of the corridor, she finds what she was looking for, a cargo truck. She starts inspecting it to see if it can run and has fuel. Meanwhile, we see that a monster is watching from atop the truck. When the robot starts sounding an emergency alarm, it's too late. Several other monsters appear and surround them. The monster on top of the truck jumps at Sharon but is taken down by the robot, which warns of a large number of monsters and advises evacuation. As Sharon runs, she orders the robot to activate full force mode. The robot, in Rambo style, starts gunning down the monsters. Sharon continues to run as the pursuing monsters fall one by one. She spots the exit right in front of her and tells the robot to keep going while she escapes. But the monsters turn around and start coming through the exit path. To make matters worse, the robot starts signaling low ammo. It switches its weapons to blade arms, but in hand-to-hand combat, the monsters seem to have the numerical advantage. Sharon wonders if she will be able to get out of there alive. She is surrounded by beasts with nowhere to escape. At the last moment, when she thinks she has no more chances, the sound of gunfire echoes down the hallway, and at the end of it are Howard and the robot. The protagonist asks if she doesn't mind acting without her partner. Sharon is in tears. For her, Howard could be dead after all this time missing. The protagonist asks what happened, if she moved. Sharon thanks for being saved, surely reflecting on having acted behind his back. Howard tells her to leave while he covers her. Before leaving, she asks about her truck and her robot left behind. According to Howard, he will take care of that too. He reaches where the robot is, and the machine is still down, attacked by the beasts. Then the protagonist and his robot rush to attack the beasts. When dawn breaks, we see Sharon fixing the truck, so the battle was a success. She is thinking about what to say to him when she gets the energy core. Sharon won't be able to make it to the launch area alone, and can't leave Howard until she fixes her robot. Thinking about how foolish it is, she wonders if she's acting human. She struggles to stop these thoughts and focus on Howard being just a tool for her to get what she wants. Howard appears and asks Sharon how the truck is doing. According to her, the truck will be able to operate on different terrains after she reinforces some parts. The protagonist stares at her for a few moments without saying anything, making the girl uncomfortable with his gaze. Then she asks why Howard is looking at her like that. Howard smiles and tells her he brought good news. Sharon wants to know what this good news is, and Howard shows her the fertilizer pellets he managed to get earlier. Howard explains that with the fertilizer, they won't need to worry about plant growth anymore, and won't need to search for shelter either. Sharon cannot contain herself when he mentions not needing to search for shelter and shouts her disagreement. He asks why Sharon disagrees with him. Sharon finally reveals that she knows the coordinates of the Su-Moon shelter and, from what she observed, the conditions there are much better than theirs. The girl puts her hands on Howard's shoulders, saying that if he wants to rebuild that place and save the survivors, he won't regret going to the shelter where their efficiency will be much higher. The protagonist thinks for a moment about what Sharon just told him, and before he could say anything, Sharon exposes that she knows about his concerns. With the truck, they can take most of the plant samples they have. Howard becomes even more thoughtful, but says okay. At that moment, our protagonist's stomach growls loudly and he's starving. Sharon is somewhat relieved that they changed the subject. Howard asks 2003 to make some food for them. Then he tells her she could start preparing things, and when she finished, she would tell him, and they could leave. He and 2003 leave her there, but Howard wonders why she seems in such a hurry to leave the shelter. He watches her from afar, wondering what she has planned behind his back. The next day they were in front of the launch platform, and by the way, it was a place quite similar to their shelter. Sharon told herself that this launch platform could take her to the moon shelter, and finally take her out of this hell. The first step now was to find the command room and contact the Su-Moon shelter. Howard tells her that he and 2003 looked around and found no sign of enemies. But anyway, they brought a lot of weapons to ensure this safety in case something happened. She tells him to separate things correctly there, that she would take a look at the command room. He says okay, but be careful, and watches her go. Howard knew there was something wrong with her inside the launch platform. Sharon reaches the door of the control room. She puts puts her hand on the scanner that analyzes her identity and then says everything is confirmed survivor identity. At that moment, Sharon starts to get very nervous. The identification had been successful. Finally, she was going to leave that shit place. She was even shaking. But then the same scanner emits a red light and informs that no power source has been found. It is impossible to open the command room. She doesn't understand what it means, that the energy core they brought wasn't enough. There were no more cores like that in the shelter, not even fragments of it. How was she going to find more? Then she remembers that there is one more fragment of the energy core that is inside 2003. But it is already too cruel on her part to leave Howard alone in this place. If she takes 2003 from him, it is likely that he will go crazy. And then the voices in her head return to torment her louder than ever, saying that she is a selfish and despicable woman. She brings bad luck, and her whole family is cursed. Sharon wonders if it is a crime to fight for her own life, and then she comes back to herself. The thoughts are gone. She tells herself that she just wanted to live like a normal person. She doesn't understand what's wrong. The opportunity to continue living is right in front of her. Sharon tells herself that all she has to do is get the energy core fragment and move on with her life. At this time, none other than our dear 2003 appears, calling for her. He says Howard asked to call her to eat, and that she should go quickly because food gets less tasty for humans when it gets cold. And then he goes back to where he came from, and Sharon stays there, looking at him, more precisely at the fragment of the energy core, everything she needs to keep living. The scene cuts to a frying pan. Our protagonist, who is frying bacon, asks Sharon if she managed to get into the control room. 2003 reaches a dish for him to use, and Howard says, "Thanks, my partner." And then the robot is happy because he received a new nickname, and the woman watches the two with a sinister look, thinking how she would get the fragment off the robot's back. They start eating, and Howard tells her he liked this place. The atmosphere there is better than in the old shelter. But Sharon says nothing, and after an awkward silence, she asks Howard if he has ever been in a situation where he keeps encountering difficulties no matter how hard he tries. This time it's Howard who remains in an awkward silence until he says yes, for sure. She asks if he has ever been in a situation where he had to resort to the most desperate means he had to solve the problem he was facing. He replies that he hasn't yet, but he knows someone who had to do that, recalling his former business partner, who in the end tried to kill him for no reason. Then Sharon asks if Howard hates him, and he reveals that he was shocked, angry, and upset when he found out what his colleague did. Later, he thought that maybe the guy had a reason to do it, something he needed to protect, even if it meant sacrificing himself. And to protect that something, he was able to do something terrible to Howard. Sharon asks what happened after that, if he forgave his colleague. But the MC doesn't respond immediately, placing his chopsticks on the table, and reveals that he asked himself what he would do if he were in Josh's place. He doesn't know what he would do. Maybe he would act the same way his colleague did. With that, the two remain silent for a while, until Sharon says that he is right, even though in her thoughts she says she feels sorry for him. A little later during the night in the shelter, Howard is sleeping with the robot recharging near him. Then the door to the room slowly opens, and the robot slowly turns to see who is entering. Before it can say Sharon's name, she signals for it to stay silent. Thus, the robot does as she asks, returning to power-saving mode. Sharon looks at the MC, worried that he might wake up, but realizes that he is sleeping deeply. Then she takes a deep breath before fulfilling her purpose in that place, which is to remove the energy core fragment that is inside the robot. She looks at the fragment, thinking that thanks to it she will be able to leave that horrible place. Before leaving the room, she takes one last look at Howard, and then leaves, telling herself that she is sorry for this. The MC, who seemed to be sleeping deeply, was actually awake and witnessed everything the girl did. She runs through the shelter's corridors, reaching the control room, and uses the fragment to power it up. She is tense, thinking that the device needs to work, until the system emits a beep and shows that it is fully powered. Then the large door of the command room opens, leaving the girl ecstatic. She is getting closer and closer to leaving this place. Information starts to appear in the room, so she tries to contact the Sumoon shelter, thinking that all this is about to end. Suddenly, a message appears on the screen, and she is informed that the launch system has been activated. Sharon is relieved that her effort seems to have paid off, and places her hand hand on a scanner, then is informed that access to the system is limited. The launch system will be shut down after a brief countdown. Sharon can hardly believe this is happening. Everything was right, so why can't she access the system? The countdown ends and a message says that the launch system has been shut down. This leaves her paralyzed as she stares at the system screen. She can't believe everything went wrong. After betraying her partner, all to escape this hell. Then she lets out her emotions, hitting the computers with a chair, screaming why this happened. Sharon just wanted to live and leave that place. She keeps repeating these words as tears stream down her face, until she collapses, still asking why this happened. Then someone asks from the shadows if she doesn't understand that this shelter was just a rumor. The girl turns, asking if it's Howard talking to her. He tells her that while she was sleeping, he investigated this place. There was never any refuge outside the planet. The S-01 system command sent messages worldwide, inciting them to come to the shelter, intending to bring energy cores and keep the place running. Sharon screams that he is wrong. The system informed her that she failed due to limited access, but that she will find a way to fix it and get out of there. Then Howard asks what she would do if none of the survivors had full access to the system. At that moment she is shocked, inquiring what he means by that. To prove it, he tells the robot to show her. Then the robot appears, still powered. The girl doesn't understand how, because she removed the core fragment it had. The MC explains that he put a spare battery in it. The robot starts typing several codes into the computer. Suddenly, a nearby door is activated. It opens fully, while Sharon remains on her knees on the ground. On the other side of the door, there appear to be several trees. A rich forest was hidden in what seems to be a giant greenhouse. Sharon is incredulous at what she sees. Then Howard says that this is the reason why this place remains active. This is the final goal of the S-01 system that must have been programmed by the previous survivors who disappeared. The MC says he found several incomplete projects and believes that if they work together they can continue their plans. However, Sharon remains in shock, saying that this can't be true. Howard is firm with her, saying that this is the reality and she has to accept it. She continues to believe that there must be another way out. She knows she was right. Sharon says that there are places Howard hasn't discovered yet, and the platform might be hidden in one of them. He begins to lose patience with this, then touches her shoulder, trying to make her accept that there is no way out. But she screams for him to take his hands off her, calling him a liar. He must have made up this whole story just to convince her to stay there. This time he loses patience. She's said enough. Is she going to die if she admits she was wrong? Obviously, she doesn't accept his words, screaming that she is not wrong. Howard sighs and tells her to wake up. She is being deceived by her own desire to survive. To reinforce what he said, he approaches and repeats that she is deceiving herself. Finally, it seems that Sharon has started to accept that she was wrong, but it's not quite like that. She doesn't believe she could have been deceived again. Then we see some memories of the girl. Sharon meets a friend while walking through a park. Her friend says that the day is beautiful and invites her for a walk, but Sharon tells her that she has a lot of homework to do. The friend says it's a shame because she was going to invite Charlie too, but he won't go if she doesn't. She says that Sharon knows how much she likes this guy and could help her. After all, they were best friends. Sharon was born into a wealthy family, but she never felt happy while growing up. When other children looked at her, they would run away, saying their parents didn't want them to play with her. This left her very shaken, to the point where she didn't want to play with anyone anymore. Her grandparents died and her father too because of her mother, and her uncle protected her in a car accident, which caused his death as well. With all these strange rumors, her mother developed depression and her end was also tragic. She was left with her only remaining grandmother, until she met a girl her age. The girl named Yami wanted to be her friend. Sharon was very happy. She is the first and only friend Sharon has ever had in her life. A few years later, while climbing a staircase, Sharon, with a very tired look, asks Yami to wait a moment. It seems they are hiking in the mountains. Yami takes her friend's hand and helps her up. Sharon asks Yami where Charlie, who she said would come too. With a strange smile, Yami says maybe he has already reached the top. Sharon stops for a moment to catch her breath as she is very tired. Yami starts talking to her, saying that she must already know this, but that, currently, Charlie likes her. Sharon doesn't understand what she is talking about, but her friend says that everyone at school knows and there's no point in lying to her. But Sharon says he is at most her friend. With a sinister look, Yami says she hates Sharon and that she disgusts her. Sharon still doesn't understand and keeps asking what she means, but her friend is very furious, saying that she stole Charlie even knowing that she was in love with him. Sharon tries to calm Yami down, saying they are best friends, but she slaps Sharon's hand and says she is not her friend, and that all this time she pretended to be her friend. She says she lost a bet, so she had to get close to Sharon. But since her family was rich, Yami got many things, so she maintained a false friendship for so long. Sharon is so naive it makes her angry. The girl telling her the whole truth and she's still asking what's going on. My God. Yami says it was she who spread rumors about Sharon. She wants to destroy Sharon for her own interests. In her mind, if Sharon dies, he will fall in love with her. So she grabs Sharon by the shoulders and asks if she will help fulfill her wishes, and pushes Sharon, who, with tears in her eyes, does nothing but scream. So we see that night has fallen. That was the night she felt most helpless. Compared to what just happened, what she went through as a child was nothing. Physically, she will never forget how painful that night was. On the other hand, the girl's heart was completely shattered. The person she trusted the most ended up betraying her. Then some hunters who were in the forest appeared, and thanks to them, she was saved. Otherwise, she would have been devoured by the animals. After that day, she could no longer trust anyone but herself. Howard calls out to her again, trying to pull Sharon out of these daydreams. Finally, she awakens to reality. The MC says she needs to put these thoughts aside and move on with life. So she gets up, calling the guy a hypocrite, and he doesn't understand what she's saying. She reveals that she knows what he thinks, that in all this time in this world, they haven't found other survivors, that he always knew she wanted to leave him, and that only one person could go to the Sumoon shelter. Since her skills are useful, he kept finding excuses to keep her by his side. Then Howard asks what she is talking about, but she doesn't admit she could be wrong and leaves the room, saying that all this is hilarious. No one could be that selfless. The MC remains silent, just observing her attitude. Sharon says there must be some scheme behind his gestures and that she will take the energy core. She will work on the launch platform and he can stay with his plants. They will be separated from now on. Howard shouts for her not to touch the core, but obviously she doesn't listen. Then an alarm goes off. An illegal invasion of the energy core was detected. The security system will be activated. The girl keeps asking what's happening. The MC runs towards her, knowing her stubbornness will cost dearly. Suddenly, something emerges from the shelter ceiling. A weapon appears. The security system has been activated, and it started the mission to exterminate the intruders. Sharon screams for her robot to protect her. Then Howard shouts for her to be careful and get down. He leaps towards her. Right at the moment the weapon fires, and manages to save the girl from being blown up. With the impact of the jump, he ends up falling on top of her on the ground. On the other hand, Sharon's robot doesn't seem to have withstood the attack. Sharon can hardly believe what happened. To worsen the situation, more weapons with laser sights appear, leaving the duo completely surrounded. Then Howard gets up, running amidst the gunfire and pulling Sharon with him. She keeps asking what's happening, but he says there's no time to explain. She needs to run if she wants to survive. Finally, the two manage to get out of the corridor full of weapons, and Howard asks the robot left behind to hurry up. It, in turn, activates the counterattack mode, and something is fired from its hand, hitting the ceiling weapon and making it explode. Our little robot keeps shooting, blowing up all the weapons that were attacking it. Suddenly, Howard notices something coming towards them. This time he panics. An attack robot is running to get them. The new robot starts firing. Howard and Sharon hide in the corner of a door, trying not to get hit. The thing seems to have infinite bullets, as it doesn't stop attacking. The MC tells the girl to stay there, probably planning a counterattack. Finally, it stops the attack and walks towards the duo until it starts beeping. After detecting life signals in a nearby corner, the robot starts running towards the vital signs. Then Howard clenches his fist. Their enemy is getting closer and closer. The MC whispers to the ally robot, gesturing towards their opponent, and the robot seems to understand what he means. As soon as the enemy robot gets very close, Howard says it's time. Then he quickly attacks the robot, punching it. However, the machine remains firm, and a superheated blade appears on the robot's arm, which makes the MC apprehensive. Even so, he grabs his enemy's arm, which certainly didn't expect that. Howard manages to throw the robot, which lands on the other side of the room. Then, our robot aims at the other and fires, blowing up its enemy. A piece of what was the robot's face falls to the ground, leaving only several twisted pieces of it. Looking worried, Sharon calls for her companion and crouches down, asking if he's okay. Now she decided to care about him. Suddenly, he becomes alert again, saying she should hide because it's not over yet. A piece of the enemy robot is making some noises, and several little robots come out of this piece, looking like several robotic moths. Then we hear that the system has activated the second-class attack mode, and the robot moths advance towards the group. Scared, Sharon asks what those things are, which at this point are almost reaching them. Suddenly, one of them lands on the robot, and he doesn't understand what it can do. The little robot starts beeping, then explodes, and the robot flies with the impact. Worried about his friend, Howard calls for him, which falls to the ground after the explosion. He says he's okay and asks the MC to protect himself. As soon as Howard turns around, he realizes that the several little robots are all coming towards him. He points the robotic prosthesis that Sharon made for him, warning the little robots to stay away. As that doesn't happen, the MC launches a fire attack in their direction, making his opponents explode in the air. Then he tells Sharon to grab the robot, flee outside the shelter, and close the gates while he holds these things off. The girl asks how he will get out, and Howard says he will catch up with them. Sharon tries to say something, but he tells them to get out of there right away. Running, she says they will wait for Howard outside the shelter. Meanwhile, he has to deal with the dozens of mini robots attacking. Even giving his best, one of them cuts his face. His leg also ends up hit. To make things worse, the prosthetic system Sharon made starts to overheat, and he manages to use the fire attack one last time, burning a few more little robots that fall to the ground without moving. Outside the shelter, Sharon managed to get out with the robot and is trying to close the gate. The system beeps and warns that the gate is closing. She managed to do as Howard asked. The gate starts lowering, creaking, and the girl screams for the MC to hurry before it's too late. He is running, still trying to get rid of the mini robots. Even so, he remains far from the exit. Now his glove prosthesis is out of power, meaning he has no offensive capability. So he focuses on running as fast as he can, and right behind him, the swarm of robots continues the chase. Crouched by the gate, Sharon keeps calling for her companion, worried that he won't make it out. The MC starts fumbling in one of his pockets. He grabs a device, saying it's his last hope and wishing he can survive. Then he presses a button that activates the device, and throws it towards his pursuers. Right after he throws the device, the bomb causes a huge explosion that throws Howard backward. With that, he is flung towards the gate. The impact is so great that he passes through the gate and ends up outside. As soon as he exits, the gate closes. Howard is lying on the ground, injured by the robots and the explosion. Desperate, Sharon screams for him. Guys, the video is over. I just wanted to ask for your attention real quick. For those who aren't subscribed, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps a lot. 87% of the audience isn't subscribed, so if you want to help, please subscribe.